Hi everyone, in the last lesson we looked at how we know climate is changing nowadays using modern instruments and taking observations of the change in landscape around us. But we also saw previously that climate has changed significantly over the last million years. So how on earth do we know what has been happening over the last million years before humans were around and before we had thermometers and satellites and information to collect all this data? So what did we do? And this whole field is called paleoclimatology. Climatology just means the study of climate, and paleo means old. So this is the study of old climates. Okay? And what scientists try to do is to reconstruct them. This word here. That means to work out. Okay, to reconstruct, to work out, to put the pieces of the jigsaw back together to figure out what the climate was like. And the final thing we're going to do is to look at why it's so important we understand how climate has changed in the past and why that is relevant to us nowadays. Now, in order to work out what the climate was like in the past, we need to use these things called proxy indicators. Because we didn't have thermometers, we don't have satellites, a proxy indicator is something that can indirectly tell us what the climate might have been like. Okay. A few of the main ones used are ice cores, rock type, fossils, tree rings, and pollen. Okay, so by studying these particular things, we can work out what the climate might have been like at a particular time. And one very valuable method that's used is taking ice cores. Many ice cores are taken from Greenland and Antarctica, which is here. This is Antarctica. And we can see each of these dots is showing the location of a different ice core. Now, one of the deepest ones is this one here called Vostok. I'll write it a bit bigger so we can see it. Vostok. And that one is 2,546 meters deep. So they've drilled down 2.5 kilometers into the ice, and when they've done that, they've pulled up what looks like this thing here, okay, which is a core of ice. And that ice, as we go deeper down, has trapped all of the gases that were in the atmosphere at that particular time. And so the Vostok ice core actually has 220,000 years worth of gases trapped as we go deeper and deeper down into the ice core. So 220,000 years. And when those gases are analysed, they can tell us a lot about what the climate was like. On the right-hand side here, we can see the equipment that they use to do this. Often the ice cores are taken from very remote locations, so they have to move all this equipment and set up a field camp. And the scientists could be there for months at a time, digging these cores, taking the ice cores out, and then analysing them to get all the data. And the reason we get this data is, as you can see on the left-hand side here, this is how glacial ice is formed. So when it snows, first of all we get these nice snowflakes, and then they eventually get crushed down a little bit to granular ice, which is this stage here, and there's only 50% air left now. And then eventually it becomes this stuff called firn, which is getting harder and harder. And as it gets compressed more and more, it takes about 25 years for this to happen, we get glacial ice, so there's a final stage here. But within the ice, there's actually lots of little air bubbles. So 20% of the mass here is made up of these tiny air bubbles. And within these air bubbles is trapped the composition, the makeup of the gases that were in the atmosphere at the time. When the scientists have done all of that and they've analysed the gases, they get something which looks a bit like this. It looks pretty scary, but we can break it down to show the key ideas. Basically, on the x-axis we've got time, so this is the present day, and this is going back to what, 420,000 years. Okay, so this is the time years before present. That's what BP stands for, before present. And we've got 4 different types of gas that are recorded here. We've got the carbon dioxide shown up here. We've got the methane shown here. We've got oxygen isotopes, which are very complicated, but basically there's oxygen isotope 18 and 16, I think, and depending on the amount of the different isotopes trapped in the gases, that can be a very good clue to the temperature. And from that data, they can work out average temperature changes. Okay, so it looks very complicated, but we can see as we go back in time, and also as we go back, as it gets deeper, we can see the changes in these variables, and that data plotted together can help us to work out the temperature and how that might have changed over the history of 420,000 years from this particular ice core. The second proxy indicator that is used is rock type. Rock type is useful because certain rocks form under different climatic conditions. For example, the top picture here, this is sandstone. And sandstone, as the name suggests, is formed from sand, which is often from deserts. Desert environment is usually very hot and dry, and therefore we can suggest that the climate in which case these rocks were formed was hot and dry. The second photo down here shows glacial till. Obviously it's a very, very different form of rock to the sandstone. The colour's different, the composition is different, the type of material that is in it is different. So this is till. Till is a material which is deposited by a glacier as it melts. So you've got lots of jumbled up bits of rock and gravel and sediment all mixed in here, which is slowly being compressed down. And so we know that because this material has been deposited by glaciers, whilst there might not be any glaciers in this area right now, in the past there would have been glaciers here. So we can say, if we can date the rocks in this particular till, we can say that the climate in the past would have been much colder than it is now. The third proxy is the use of fossils. Fossils are the remains or the skeletal remains of animals and plants that are recorded within rocks. And some species have very particular climatic niches. That means that they don't survive very well in conditions that go beyond what they're capable of living in. One example of this is coral reefs, which we can see on the right hand side here, and here's a fossil of some corals. We know today what conditions corals like to survive in, and we know that if the seas get a bit warmer or they get a bit colder, then the corals struggle to survive. So when we find coral remains in the sediments within the sea, we can tell that the conditions in the past must have been like they are in coral reef areas today. And from using that data, we can tell what the climate would have been like at a particular point in the past. So the final paragraph down here says, therefore, where fossil corals are found, we can be quite confident of the conditions in which they were growing and use this to help determine what the climate would have been like. The fourth proxy that is used is tree rings. As trees grow, they grow in rings. We can see these rings on this particular example here. There's the circular pattern. And some trees can grow for up to maybe 1,000 years. So within the tree rings, we can get 1,000 years worth of data from some particular trees. Now, as they grow, the more growth there is, the wider the tree ring. So if we get a warm and wet year, we would expect quite a wide tree ring to grow. If it is a much colder, drier year, then you would expect the trees not to grow so much, and so the tree ring then would be much smaller. So we can see here, this blue one would be quite small, representing a cold, dry year, and where we've got a warm, wet year, we would expect it to be much, much wider. And so if we look in the history of the tree, and then compare this to other trees within the region or other regions, we can start to put together a picture of how the climate might have been like in particular years as we go back from tree ring to tree ring to tree ring. The fifth method is called pollen analysis. Pollen is produced by lots of flowering plants. As that pollen is produced, it gets blown away in the wind, and some of it will settle in lakes and ponds and oceans. It'll eventually find its way to the bottom of those lakes, and more mud and sediment will fall on top of it, squashing it down within the layers. Now we can take a mud core, much the same as the ice core, that goes down into the sediment found within the lake or an ocean and so on. You pull up that mud core and we can start to analyse what pollen we get at different depths within the mud. And the deeper down, the older the pollen would be at a particular point. And we can go down here. This is a particular core taken from Illinois in America. This goes down and shows data for the last 17,000 years. Okay. Now certain plants grow in certain conditions. So if we can start to map the amount of pollen of different species at different depths, we can tell what the climate must have been like for that plant to be growing at that particular time. Now I'm just going to take you through this example to show how pollen analysis can be used to determine the climate and how that has changed over time. So this is from Kane County in Illinois in the United States, and we can see 17,000 years ago the dominating pollen at this particular core was sedges, and that is relevant around about here, which I've just highlighted. Now sedges are low-lying shrub or grass, and it's mainly found in a cold environment, much like we would expect to see in the tundra, which is Tundra. Okay, so we can tell where this is dominating here, it's going to be pretty cold. And then we get a change starting to occur as we see the spruce trees starting to become much more dominant and the sedges starting to go down a bit. And that happened about 14,000 years ago, where the spruce tree was dominant. And that represents a changing of the climate. The climate has got a bit warmer, and so the trees have been able to start to grow. As the climate changed again, we see a transition to ash trees. Okay, so if we look on the pollen analysis diagram, here is ash. All right, so we had a decline in the amount of spruce going up to about 11,000 years ago, from 12 to 11,000 years ago, and an increase in ash at the same time. That's suggesting that this change here is due to both a warmer climate and also wetter. So we can see this transition from the tundra environment to where we get an environment dominated by spruce trees, okay, finally through to an environment dominated by ash trees. And as we go through, we can see even more changes occurring as ash starts to die out, and then we start getting a few more elm trees, and then finally oak becomes the dominant landscape for the last 11,000 years or so, as the climate is much more like it is now. The most important question, though, is why should we care about studying these past climates? Why do these scientists put all the effort in to understanding what has happened over the last million years or so? Okay, so why should we care? All right. Now, we've seen in the previous lesson that temperature is rising very quickly at the moment. Here it is. But we also saw that temperature has been rising in the past climates very quickly and then dropping down to these glacial periods, then warming again to interglacials. And we can see that on this graph here, where we've got really rapid warming and then cooling, then warming, then cooling, then warming and cooling, and so on, until we get to today, where we've got this rapid period of warming. So if we didn't have this past climate data, we couldn't tell how significant this current stage of warming is. If we look at the past 2,000 years, here we are, this is the year 2000 nowadays, this is going back to 500 AD, and here is the green lines is the proxy-based reconstruction. So this is the information that we've collected from the tree rings, from the pollen, from the ice cores, and so on. And you'll notice that the light green area is the level of uncertainty, because this data, it's relatively precise, but there's going to be some degree of error. And so that illustrates this degree of margin of error that we've given ourselves here. But we've got this warming occurring here. Okay. Now, if we can look at the changes in the past, we can then start to determine just how significant the current warming is. If we can't compare it to the past, then we don't know the significance of it. So this past data is incredibly important to help us decide and figure out if the current warming is due to human influences or if it's entirely natural. Alright, so hopefully now we understand the different ways that we can construct past climates, and that we should know that that is called paleoclimatology. Make sure you've got notes to record the different ways we can work out these past climates, and make a note to say why this is so important. What is the relevance of collecting all this data and trying to work out how climate has changed in the past?